Those who are avid viewers of In the Huddle know that the person that is next to me in this window right now is not James Baker. This is Greg Thomas, also known as Wally Wabash to those of you that are big fans of D3Football.com. And Greg, Wabash was a team that was definitely on the board, so maybe we have to actually ask you to leave this call because, your team's under consideration. I think you have to leave.
They are. I believe decorum dictates that I have to recuse myself for a little bit here until we find out who these 5 teams are that get at large.
Well, we actually already know at this point. When we're recording this, we had a little bit of advanced knowledge on this, but we want to thank J.P. Williams at the NCAA for helping us get our advanced look so that we could do our interview today with the committee chair, Jim Catanzaro. He's coming up here in a second. Just overall, briefly here, we asked Greg to join me because he's a bracketologist on D3Football.com. Greg, just a brief thought on what you saw in those brackets, then we'll ask the man himself about how they got put together.
The bracket that we saw today looked a lot like the bracket that our friends at D3Football.com put together last night. A lot of the pairings are familiar. Some not so much. There are some surprises. The at-large teams were not so surprising as we'll see and talk about. But those are the first impressions that I had of the bracket.
And so let's, without further ado, bring in our distinguished guest for the 11th straight year. We are interviewing the committee chair. You could name all of them. I bore everybody to tears right now, but last year was Darla Kirby. She's on the committee still, and we're going to bring in Jim Catanzaro, who is a person that actually got to stay on the whole call, I believe, because his school was not under consideration, and that's a big benefit to us because we get to ask him all the questions. He knows exactly what happened. Obviously, there are some restraints in terms of what he can tell us and what he can't, so we will abide by that to the degree we can. But Coach Cat, I don't know what exactly to call you besides committee chair and distinguished guests. Welcome to join us in the huddle.
Thanks, I appreciate it. I wish I wasn't on that call the whole time and my team was under consideration. It would have been a better end of the season yesterday instead. So I would like to have that to look forward to. Well,
the future. Let's look to the future. The Foresters are obviously a team that is under very good coaching with you at the helm, and so we'll see where that goes down the line here. For the last 24 hours, though, you have been sort of in Selection Central in Indianapolis. That's where you are right now. Why don't you give us a rundown of what you've been through over the last 24 hours and the committee for that matter, and on top of that, the racks, because folks don't always realize that this is still a regional process to the national process ultimately on Selection Saturday night. So give us kind of the rundown of what happened here.
Yeah, so we finished our game at the University of Chicago yesterday, and I got in a car with one of our assistant coaches, drove down to Indianapolis, but on the way, sat in on the South Region RAC conference call, their final call, and then started the West Region RAC call, basically as I was getting into the building. Once I got here and we had the updated Regional Advisory Committee rankings sent to us, we were able to start putting together our whole committee, all the members from across the nation, 8 different individuals, and start putting the bracket, or we started to look at the Pool B and Pool C teams that we were going to consider and kind of do our voting on that. Once the voting for the Pool B and Pool C teams was complete, that's when we started working on the bracket, and that's where all the individuals who are on our national committee whose teams are in the tournament are now not able to be on the phone call. And so at that point, they remove themselves from the discussion, and the remaining of us kind of work towards putting the bracket together within the constraints that we have from the NCAA.
How many were actually forced to leave that call, and for how long generally were they off that call? I know Eric Hart, for instance, from Brockport is on the committee, and Brockport obviously was probably a conversation about whether to be a 1 seed or whatever for some period of time. So how long were they off the call? Darla Kirby, too, for that matter, for UMHB.
Yeah, so we had Darla, Eric, and Tony Kuczynski from Berry. They were off the call the entire time. They were not part of any of the bracketing that we did because it could impact their team. So once we selected our teams, it was left, or the Pool C and Pool B team, that was left to the rest of us on the committee to kind of put together from that point on.
So just for the record, we clarify that the the Pool C teams are Bethel, John Carroll,
Hardin-Simmons, Center, Muhlenberg.
There you go.
And can we confirm that Muhlenberg was the last team in?
No, I can't. We don't really discuss when they do, but I think that one of the things that everybody kind of knows about our process, you'll be able to figure it out once our final regional rankings come on as to what teams from the South went first or second. But deciding who they went across the other regions on, that's up for we keep that kind of in the magic potion box, if you will.
And those final regional rankings are due out on Sunday night, like they happened the last couple of years. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So one thing Greg's kind of getting at, who was the last team in. I won't ask you, specifically on consideration, but there's always this question of primary and secondary criteria and the discussion that goes in the mix with those situations. There's Team Linfield, obviously, that had a loss against, I think it was an NAIA team that was not exactly a trailblazer in the NAIA this year with their win-loss record. At what point does a team like Linfield have that loss in that case examined a little more carefully? Is it right off the bat? Is it later on? Just because they're called primary and secondary, is that something that means it waits for a little while? Take us through that a little bit to the degree you can.
To be honest with you, the secondary criteria didn't come into a lot of play this year. The primary criteria was really where we hung our hat as a committee as to who we were looking at. I think that one of the things, if you've heard me speak before, we also look for the quality wins. And I think that, that's something that's just as important as how many losses does a team have. Once we get into the Pool C bit, who did they beat? Who have they played? I think that the NAIA game for several of the teams that were under consideration, as well as a couple teams that had played Division II teams, I'm not sure that those really got to the forefront of the decision making. We really tried to look at their Division III body of work. For the most part, I do think that there was some consideration, but we don't really even discuss it until they get on the board. So if their regional ranking spot doesn't come up, they don't really get discussed until they're on the board with the other three teams. And then amongst those teams, does that matter in the decision of who goes in and who doesn't go in?
Now, Greg and I, before the call with you here, we're kind of discussing the regionalization a little bit of what the brackets look like and how it plays out. Greg, specifically, you have a couple of questions, so do I think, about some of the pairings and how they played out exactly. Why don't you go ahead and start?
I think the one that jumps out immediately, because it's the first pairing in the bracket, is Mary Hardin-Baylor and Hardin-Simmons. These are two teams from the same conference that have been in the tournament a number of years running now. And in the last couple of years, the selection committee has been able to separate those two conference rivals for at least one round. And this year, they were not able to. Is that a function of proper seeding from the committee, or is that a function of geography and financial constraints?
I would definitely say on the committee's behalf, it was a 100% financial, and with the flight that it would require, it adds more than one flight when it all ends into it, because people have to fly other places because of that matchup changing out. I think that it's really getting back to the D3 philosophy as it currently stands of, in the first round, trying to limit flights, keeping it in the region, and that's kind of across all sports. And then as you move on in the tournament, because we can't predict victories and we can't predict who's going to win, open it up for more flights at that point if necessary. But in the first round in particular, you'll see this in every sport across. We'd gotten kind of away from that as a football committee over the last couple of years, and we're really asked to recenter that from the NCAA.
I'm looking, he was at the upper left. I'm going to go to the bottom right on the brackets, and we're going to show folks the bracket on the screen as we talk about these, so rest assured they're seeing it as we do here. And I'm kind of focusing in on what was the bottom right of last year's brackets as well, if I remember correctly, the East-centric bracket. This is something that the committee last year took some heat on in terms of, the thought that maybe some things could have been mixed up, per se. We end up seeing Johns Hopkins invited into the party, I guess, and Del Val cast the Mount Union quarter of the brackets. I'm sure they thank you for that. But the same philosophy here is that it became kind of an East region quarter down there. What's the view there? Was it something you tried to avoid? Was it something you were aware of, kind of the criticism that came from it last year from some folks, not everybody, but some folks? And how satisfied are you with that?
I'm pretty satisfied with the East. I think we knew kind of coming in with a number of AQs geographically centered over there. There are a few teams over there that are actually really hard to travel out to other places. Huston being one of them. They only had one or two matchups that really fit within the 500-mile radius for their first-round matchup. And then even a team, we do have that stretch team there with MIT, going to Johns Hopkins. And so that is kind of a cross-region battle of two teams that don't particularly get to play each other against a whole lot. But I thought we were able to kind of get a little bit of – there were some teams in there, I think, not having to go out to the Mid-Atlantic and rewarding some of their play and performance. A team like Frost in a true East bracket, I think they kind of earned up one of our top – I don't want to call it a top seed, but I think they were one of the top two regionally ranked teams for the entire time. And so I think that there was some credit given to their body of work as well. So I think we felt like we had a pretty strong East region, if you will, this year.
Greg?
Looking at the top seeds in the tournament, Mount Union and Mary Hardin-Baylor, I think we always assumed were going to be 1 and 2, the top 2 seeds in the tournament, and then the next 3 maybe kind of a big decision to make between Whitewater and St. John's and Brockport. Whitewater and Brockport had been given those other top seeds, and my question is: we know that there's a provision in the criteria that allows you to pick up on last year's tournament results for undefeated teams. Is that something that comes into play when you're seeding these top 4 teams, and maybe a differentiator between Brockport and St. John's?
We have that ability, but I don't think that we really lent on that. Really, it was the racks and kind of where they ranked teams. And so when you looked at those teams across region, St. John's wasn't going to be a top seed in the East region. That's just not a geographic thing that's going to happen. So I think that was kind of more. And I also don't know that the two teams, when they matched up, if you looked at everything as 10-0 teams, I don't know that there's enough to differentiate between one being higher than the other and how far down the line to split hairs would you have to do to distinguish who was higher up. And I don't know that I'm necessarily confirming that, 3, 4, and 5 and 6, if you will, were discussed in that same order.
So, from what we've been told in previous years, let me put it this way, the general idea the committee has is to group up the 1s, group up the 2s, kind of split them out so that there's kind of a balance across the country, and, put a 2 under the 1, a pot of a 2 under a pot of a 1, etc. Was that able to happen? Because obviously there are geographic constraints sometimes that wouldn't allow it to happen. In your mind, did all the 1s get 2s underneath them pod-wise, or is there something that might have been affected by the travel situation?
Travel definitely kind of played into the mix a little bit as far as who we were going to be able to get to certain teams. And it's not even just as simple as the 1 and the 2. It's who can get to the 1 and who can get to the 2, as well as get to whoever that other team in the bottom half of that bracket is. I think that the 8 teams will be hosting through, or who we or getting the hosting in the first rounds. I think you can see some very good matchups and some teams that can kind of prove themselves. I don't know that I have a great answer for you, but I think that there was a lot of discussion, particularly when you got to the 1-loss teams, and geography does play a part in that. And there's not enough crossover play between some of the regions to really identify where those teams fit.
There's some good 1-loss teams, as Greg knows, that didn't quite get picked at the end of the day. I think there were about 24 or 25 undefeated and 1-loss teams that we ended up with ultimately, and not all of them get in at the end of the day. Right, Greg?
That's right. But, as I understand the structure of the tournament, it is first a tournament of champions, and then we sort of round it out up to 32 with some at-large teams. And it's unfortunate as a fan of Wabash to be one of the bubble teams on the outside, but win your conference and win your automatic qualifier is the only guaranteed way in, and I think everybody that starts the season knows that. So it's disappointing, but not unexpected.
Well, Greg, as somebody who has a Wabash alum as a neighbor, and I coached with Pete Metzelars at Wingate University, I'm not expecting great Christmas cards when I get back today. So I'll have to live with that.
Coach, I'm going to let Ray kind of think on that one for a half a second. There's another rematch in the upper left, the Maryville Berry situation. That's one, we probably could nickname this question and answer session every year, hey, why are we playing them again? Because we had that happen for many years with Hardin-Simmons and with Mary Hardin-Baylor. Mary Hardin-Baylor and Linfield, I think at one point may have had a rematch a couple of years back, but at least they weren't playing Hardin-Simmons again. But the philosophy or the questions that we often get are why? And you kind of explained the travel budget and everything else earlier. Is it something, though, that the committee truly tries to work on and ultimately, somebody over and above says, look, we love to do it, we can't do it? How does that mechanism work, and to what degree did you try to avoid it?
We tried to avoid it at all costs that we were allowed to spend, if you will. We tried very hard not to have that, but really with Berry, there was only two teams that could travel there on ground, and that was Maryville and Center. So either one would have been a rematch. So they were kind of rewarded with the not to have to play a rematch that was also a conference play where there was a chance to kind of get outside that. Now, where we're really trying to approach this is at the championships committee level and in the budget process, which I sat in on a meeting this past September. As we talk about the philosophy of Division III, how important is that to our championships? And is that something that we can put as one of the, I don't want to say primary criteria because I don't want that to get confused with the regional rankings, but as a major criteria of how we seed and bracket our tournament is making that one of the primary decision makers we have of not having rematches or conference teams play each other and trying to create that. Again, the place where we really get hammed down with that are those teams that are geographically isolated from a lot of other teams. And when you're down to one or two teams that can actually make that trip without a flight, that's where we really get into some problems of you just happen to have two teams that played non-conference and they both won their conference championship, and there's nobody else within 500 miles of one of the schools. So you're going to be looking at that kind of situation to try and spread those games as best you can. But unfortunately, the geography just doesn't work in some of those outlying areas.
Coach, I know we've talked a bit about flights, but I want to go one more with you here. When you're putting together the bracket, how deep into the bracket do you have to look when tracking the number of flights that you're building into the bracket? Like, how careful do you have to be to pair the pairings in such a way that you can go 2, 3, or 4 rounds with guaranteeing that whoever wins what game in a region, there will be no flights? Is that something that you guys really have to be careful to look at?
I mean, we don't want to have 8 flights in the next round, but I think that we are given a lot of freedom from the NCAA after the first round. That as the teams win, we can't predict who's going to win. Now, if both teams are 500 plus miles away from the other two teams, we're probably going to get that one pushed back a little bit. But if it's one of the 4 teams is maybe in that second round, it has to be a flight. You can see that actually in some of the other pods this year. They're right on that cusp. They're like 517 miles. So that would actually be a flight. And so when those types of things happen, we don't actually count those out. We don't try to predict who's going to win, because I think we've all seen in the game of football that on any given Saturday, especially in the playoffs, you can have a big upset. And if that happens, we're not going to stop that team from flying somewhere to play their game. Last year, Huston's an example of that. Second round, they had a flight after they got the win over Springfield. There will be other teams that could be up for that kind of consideration this year. So we're not necessarily hamstrung as much after the first round, because that's the only round we truly have control over who's playing. There's enough with who wins that predicts the next round that we can't necessarily say that that's what's going to happen.
following up with Gray's question, I think I know where he's going with this a little bit too. There were possibilities to intermix the upper right and lower right brackets to a certain degree in terms of some of the teams in the western part of the East region, let's say, if that's such a thing, and the eastern side of the North region or South region to a certain degree because of the overlap. That people always assume the map is split into equal quadrants. Not for us. It's not. It's very northeast centric, et cetera, for those that are not aware of it. But there was possibly the opportunity to intermix some of those teams, and it wasn't chosen to be the course ultimately. Let's say about 15 years ago, there was a choice or decision, maybe even longer than that, maybe back in 1998, in fact, there was a choice to avoid the regionalization to a certain degree. That's when we started seeing Mount Union placed on top of East teams. It wasn't the East bracket, the North bracket, South and West anymore. The feel of this one, though, I'm not going to lie to you, is a little bit more regionalized, almost like it's a step back in that time. Not that we're going backward or moving backward, but that we're sort of getting more regionalized again. Is there anything to read into that idea here, or what's your view when you're faced with that question?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm a proponent for is playing across the regions, but sometimes that doesn't mean playing across geography. Some of the teams in the South region are very east or also very west, and I think that northeast quadrant really does get a little quirky with the number of teams that are there, because not all the teams in the Connecticut's and the Massachusetts can get to Ohio to play a game. There are some that can. And I think that's really where the harder part is when you're looking at the top 3 to 4 teams in the region. How do they really stack up? Are they teams that have a chance to go a couple rounds deep in the tournament? Are they really good programs? Have they made playoff runs before? But I also think that you're starting to see other teams play well out of the East region, maybe more so than they were in the mid-2000s when they go deeper into the playoffs. That they're not getting, it's not, hey, I win the first 2 games and now I play a Mount Union and lose by 70. They're playing other teams at a very high level, and I think that part is a credit to that region for football. But I also think that where the AQs come from really help dictate some of the map as to who can be there.
One other thing I want to ask you about too, and I almost lost in the mix here, looking down my notes, is on just the overall, a position you had taken in what we call ATN Podcast 216. Yes, we had some good music on that one, if I remember correctly. But anyway, you had a discussion about strength of schedule. That was going to be a key thing. You were trying to standardize the regional advisory committee's rankings to a certain degree based on it and whatnot. And, the first thing you guys did last night, guys and ladies did last night as a committee, was have to probably look at Pool B. And you had a team in Thomas More, for instance, that had a pretty good strength of schedule, had what I would call a very good subjective strength of schedule, even with some of their losses. Then you had an MIT team that had more of a below 500, we'll call it, strength of schedule, and 1 loss versus 3 losses. Was there any temptation, to the degree you can tell us, was there much of a long discussion, maybe is the better way to ask it, so you can answer it, about supplanting MIT in that situation? Because you look at Pool B the same way you look at Pool C by region, from what I understand. Was there any temptation, based on the time the discussion occurred, to place a 3-loss team on top of a 1-loss team because of that strength of schedule scenario? It
was discussed, and to be honest with you, it was discussed with pretty good depth, I would think. I think that was the one time in the last 4 to 5 years that I can remember talking to other people where the Pool B conversation extended beyond maybe a courteous discussion, because it was so clear in other years. Last year, Springfield at 10-0 was a pretty clear-cut Pool B. Mary Hardin-Baylor and Hardin-Simmons had been Pool B candidates prior to that. So I think that there was a much more in-depth discussion. I'd actually said, I think on 216, that Pool B is usually our quickest discussion. And last night, that wasn't really the case. There was much more depth about that. I think that the overall feeling of the committee was that the 9-1 record against a lower strength of schedule kind of trumped the 7-3 record with the higher strength of schedule. I think that the wins again, were more important than who did you lose to. And I think that part was the part that really came out of it and part of the discussion.
I see here sort of an interesting nugget in this bracket is Trine is once again hosting the Midwest Conference champion, St. Norbert. They did the same thing last year with Monmouth. To the degree that the committee is aware of those kinds of matchups year over year, do you try and avoid like those kinds of two conference champions playing the same game or playing a rematch in the first round year over year, or is that not really is that too many layers deep during the bracketing process to have that awareness and try to change those up year over year?
Yeah, and as somebody who's in the Midwest Conference, I was very, very acute to that. And that was actually one of the games that kind of flipped a couple of times with some of the matchups with geography. Trine is kind of centrally located to a lot of other teams by being in Indiana. I think had Monmouth won that game and been there, I don't think we'd see a rematch of those two teams. However, I think that it's not the same team, so whether it's a conference rematch, I don't think we consider that nearly as much as we would if it was the same actual teams playing one another.
So, Coach, how long did Pool C really take? Let's go, throw out the script here a little bit. But how long did it really take to do Pool C last night? Because now we're at only 5 teams compared to the old days when it was 7 or 8. When I think we moved to 32, or at some point I think it was at least 7. I'm getting old; the memory's fading. Don't worry about me. But what was the timing? I mean, did it escalate as the 5 picks occurred, where you had kind of a bang 1-2 situation? To the degree you can, again, take us through how that process worked.
I mean, if you're talking about time on the clock, it took about an hour and a half, and that was sometimes it's more of a getting the East Region people that are voting to know more about a West Region team or to know more about a South Region team, because as much as they've done their homework, we've really asked them to be the experts on the teams in their regions, and then each regional, the 2 reps from each region, to really be the experts to bring that to the table and look at the nuances and the differences and things with each of those teams. When you've got 2 9-1 teams who have lost to a team in the regional rankings only, looking at that, who they've won, and who those losses were to. The one thing we don't get into is the margin of victory. That's the one thing we don't discuss. And so looking at the actual just who they lost to, where those rankings are, that was a much bigger part of what we were doing. And I think that probably took, probably close to an hour, maybe a little bit more, closer to an hour and a half, just as we went through each, because we only vote on 1 per time. So there are still 5 rounds, making sure that we get that right.
So, Coach, we want to wrap up here a little bit. We're almost at the 30-minute mark, which is what we kind of promised to keep you. But there's a question I ask every year. You talked a little bit about some of the stuff that you're trying to do, in your committee role, but outside the committee per se, to affect positive change for teams down the line. But we always ask the question, anything you would do differently if you could, and if you could get the NCAA to maybe change. We hear the travel airplane answer every year. I have to be honest with you. So I know you're not a guy that likes to be redundant on stuff like that. So what regrets do you have, if any, and what would you change or have the NCAA basically change at this point?
I would really like to try and prevent conference matchups repeating in the first or second round. I know the geography, that's a really hard thing to do, and that's why we're not able to do it right now. But to the extent that we could this year, we really tried to do that. I think that was part of the Bethel St. John's, where they ended up playing. I think that was an effort there. I think with Center and Berry, we tried to do that. I think with the teams that come in as an at-large from the Pool C, it's critical that we do whatever we can, both as a committee and from the NCAA perspective, to not have those teams coming into the tournament to play each other. Football is a rare sport. We can only play one game a week. We can't expand the tournament to add more teams in. And so to me, I think that that's really the biggest thing is, can we find a way to not have teams have to play a conference opponent? Now, if you get the regionally ranked the situation like you do where 2 conference champions played a non-conference game, that to me is a little bit different. But especially the teams that are within the same conference having to play each other in the first 2 rounds, that's the one thing I'm going to try to keep pushing in my last year on the committee next year, to really see if we can get the championships committees above us to kind of sign off on that. And I think that, the last couple of years, we were able to get Hardin-Simmons to not have to play Mary Hardin-Baylor after they basically played for who knows how many years. And unfortunately, this year is one of those years where they had to go back to each other. And so to me, I think that's my number one thing. It's not even so much the flights, although it does impact at least one conference pretty traditionally with a flight. It's really more about just making sure that the conference teams don't have to play one another in that first 2 rounds.
If asked, would you chair the committee again next year with your one remaining year?
If asked, I will do that. As long as JP continues to take care of me, I will do that.
I wish we could get JP on camera once in a while. He never shows on camera. He likes to be the guy behind the scenes, I think, too much, but he is really the brains behind the operation, is he not?
He really brings a great, presence to it. He's been around it as long as anybody has. And I think one of the things that is good for him is he tries to stretch. He understands football. He understands what we're trying to do for the players. And he doesn't try to just limit it to the black and white, bylaws, but he also has a job that requires him to do certain things. And so as we start to propose, spending $250,000 on a flight and things of that nature, it's like, well, you can't really fly that team to that place at the same as you would if you flew them into a hub or something like that. And so I think that he brings some of that stuff where I think if you let me just have a bracket and try to seed it 1 through 32, we'd have a very different bracket than what we have. And it would be different teams, but they'd be crisscrossing each other midair on Friday going to their games, and we'd have to find a way to pay for it.
One thing when I saw the location for the Stag Bowl change, obviously from Salem to Shenandoah for the next 2 years, the one person I thought about was JP because of all people involved that we deal with every year, he's probably the one that is going to be most affected by that change because it takes a lot to get a new city ready to go. Ultimately, I will see you down there, though, and see him as well for what will be, I think, a really good championship game. No matter how these brackets play out, year after year, we always say to folks like yourself, this is a great matchup ultimately, and we had a great tournament. Even though we had some concerns or questions about the first round or second round or this or that, we always seem to have some real solace in the idea that the teams playing in Salem, now Shenandoah, are the teams that probably should have been there in the first place. So we appreciate what you guys do and the time you spend on this. And thank you for joining us as well on In the Huddle for the 11th straight year, the committee chair.
I appreciate you having me on. It was a great opportunity. And, I'm just happy to be the first actual coach to sit in this chair in a long time. So hopefully this will start a new trend for you guys to get some more coaches involved.
We would love that, and also somebody that can stay on the entire call because I think there's some real value in that. Nothing against what Darla Kirby added to the show last year, but to get the insight from start to finish is a great thing for us to at least get the transparency that I know is important to you to provide to all of us. So thank you again.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
Thank you, Coach.